As we come on the air tonight, we have breaking news. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has launched ballistic missiles at bases in Iraq, where U.S. troops are stationed. Casualties are unknown at this hour. Iran says it is retaliating for the targeted killing of General Qasem Soleimani last Friday by a U.S. drone strike. This comes as President Trump is being pressed for more detail about why he ordered the killing of Soleimani. Our foreign affairs correspondent, Nick Schifrin, is here with me now in the studio. Nick, all this has been breaking in the last few hours. What do we know at this hour about what the Iranians have done? So
I just got off the phone with a U.S. military official who described in pretty good detail exactly the size of this attack. So it's a little after 1 a.m. local, with 15 rockets fired from inside of Iran, and that's significant. We'll talk about that in a second. You can see some video there of what we believe to be these rockets being fired. So 15 rockets fired from inside Iran toward these bases in Iraq. 10 of them, so the majority of them, were targeted at one base, the Al-Assad base in Iraq, right outside of Baghdad. And we believe that this video is from that base, and you see one strike there. So 10 of the 15 ballistic missiles fired from Iran at that base. An additional missile fired at a separate U.S. base in the north of the country in Erbil. That's Kurdish territory where the U.S. Has been fighting ISIS and training Iraqi forces as well. And in addition, 4 of these missiles failed. So total 15 missiles fired from Iran into Iraq at the U.S. bases or at Iraqi bases with U.S. soldiers on them. 10 of them or 11 of them hitting, 4 of them failing.
So U.S. troops, we know, are based, are located at these bases. There are other U.S. bases, places where U.S. troops are located around Iraq.
There are, yeah. The U.S. doesn't like to talk about the number of those bases, of course, but the point is that Iran chose these targets, chose the main U.S. air base in Iraq. That's where President Trump visited, met troops. That's the base also that President Trump is talking about in the last couple of days about how expensive and how important it is, as well as this base in the north. And they did not hit other U.S. bases in Iraq.
What do we know, Nick, at this hour about casualties?
So the military is saying they don't have an official estimate yet, but I did talk to a defense official and asked this official that question, and the answer was, we have good early warning systems. So let's put that a slight strange comment into some context. These missiles are flying from about 180, 190 miles away. Talk to some missile experts. They take about 5 to 7 minutes to get to these bases. It takes about 30 seconds or so for the U.S. to spot them, only about 10 or 20 seconds more for these bases to know that they're coming. So give or take, there's 3 to 4 minutes for each of these bases to know that these missiles are coming. Doesn't sound like a lot of time, Judy, but the U.S. has been fortifying these bases, has been working with the soldiers and the service members at these bases to be able to hunker down quickly, and those 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes really do allow these soldiers to get to a place where they can withstand, at least they hope, the impact of these missiles. So the U.S. military hinting, perhaps, that those fortifications were successful.
And in fact, the Iranians have been saying ever since the killing of General Soleimani that there would be a retaliation. So the U.S. has had every reason to expect something. So one has to assume they were getting ready.
Not only were they getting ready, but they actually put pause on the ISIS campaign, right? The reason that U.S. troops are there to fight ISIS and to train Iraqi soldiers, and they actually put pause on that campaign so that they could fortify, and they also moved troops around the country to be able to move them away from some of the bases that they thought were more vulnerable into bases that are less. They won't share the specifics of that, but let me show you those specific bases. So we think that these ballistic missiles were shot from the western part of Iran, which you see there, and you see Baghdad in Iraq, next to Baghdad or near Baghdad, Al-Assad Air Base. That's that main base that you and I were just talking about. And in the north, the second base where it was hit, that's the base in Erbil. Those are the 2 targets.
And it reminds us, looking at this map, just how close. I mean, Iran, Iraq, next door to one another. Iran, General Soleimani was in Iraq, working with the Iraqi militias and others.
Right, and so Soleimani was killed, the U.S. says, because he leads this network of pro-Iran groups, these Shia proxies, as Iran calls them, all over the region. And usually Iran uses those proxies, uses those allied groups in order to attack the U.S. What's significant about this strike tonight is that Iran's military, Iran's Revolutionary Guard, fired at the U.S., not through a proxy, not deniable. They announced that they had done it, and the U.S. is now blaming the Revolutionary Guard for doing this with ballistic missiles, with a higher level of missile than some of those proxies have. So this is the first time that Iran has struck at U.S. bases and claimed credit, usually proxies. It's also the first time that Iran has fired a missile at the U.S. or any country's military in more than 30 years. Again, what Iran usually does is use these other groups, use this network of proxies around the region. What is significant about this, their escalation, is that they declare that they did it themselves.
Militia groups and, others, Hezbollah and others in other countries. So, Nick, all this takes place, at a time when the U.S., when people looking at the U.S. relationship with Iran are asking bigger questions about what does that relationship consist of now?
What does that relationship consist of, and what is the U.S. strategy for either escalation tonight or de-escalation? And so earlier today, Judy, I talked to two experts about that question of the strategy, and I was asking them about the initial reports. That's Mara Karlin. She worked at the Pentagon during the Bush and Obama administrations, now with Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I also talked with Michael Doran. He was the senior director for the Middle East on the National Security Council staff for the Bush administration, now at the Hudson Institute, to the think tank in Washington. And I began by asking Mara Karlin about her reaction to the initial reports of these Iranian airstrikes.
Yes, this is probably the first event that we will see of a slew of others, Nick. The U.S. set a new bar by killing Qasem Soleimani, who we can all agree was a horrific human being who is catastrophic for U.S. national security interests. But in killing him, as I said, it's a new bar. And now the Iranians are starting to retaliate, and I suspect we will see a whole lot more in and around the region over the coming days, weeks, and potentially months.
Michael Doran, some of the critics of this attack, as you know well, were worried about a cycle of escalation happening after this attack. Do you have that worry, especially now as we see, as Mara Karlin says, perhaps the first of a few attacks from Iran?
Well, it didn't start with the attack on Qasem Soleimani. The Iranians have been escalating in a very deliberate fashion since last April, deliberate but incremental. That escalation ended up with the killing of an American. Now we have a new level of escalation where they're attacking us from Iran. We have no choice now whatsoever. We're under attack. This is war. We have no choice but to win the escalation ladder.
Mara Karlin, are you worried about, as Michael Doran just said, the escalation ladder? And do we have no choice? Do we just have to simply keep climbing the ladder, so to speak?
It's profoundly concerning. This has been going on for a while. Both the U.S. and the Iranians have taken a wide variety of escalatory steps. But hitting someone so senior in the Iranian national security apparatus is an entirely different ballgame. It is still unclear why the U.S. hit Soleimani, where they hit him, and when they hit him. And I fear that we are going to spin further out of control without a whole lot of clarity as to why.
Michael Doran, do you believe that the Trump administration has clarity as to why they hit Qasem Soleimani and why this escalation is okay?
Oh, absolutely. The Iranians had made a decision, Qasem Soleimani was implementing it, to throw the United States out of Iraq. That's why they were attacking our bases. That's why they killed an American there. And that's why they attacked the embassy. I mean, we saw it with our own eyes, what was happening. Those militias on the ground in Iraq are armed, trained, equipped, and controlled by Iran. Everyone knows that. That's not what Trump has said to the Iranians is, we're not going to play this game anymore where you hit us with militias and we respond against the militias. We know that you're doing it, and we're going to respond to you. This is not something that Donald Trump brought on the United States. The Iranians have been fighting this war against us now since last April.
Mara Karlin, what about that? The idea that President Trump, by killing Soleimani, has essentially restored deterrence on Iran, and that this was Iran's escalation long before the U.S. escalated.
Look, this is a story that lasts years, to put it lightly, but it is pretty clear that the U.S. and the Iranians are now in a tit-for-tat escalatory spiral. It is hard to imagine how this turns out well. And frankly, Soleimani is probably spinning with delight in his grave. If one of his goals was to push the U.S. military out of Iraq, it appears as though he may be getting that wish sooner rather than later.
Michael Doran, you argued before that Iran was controlling a lot of these militias in Iraq, but of course the U.S. military has great influence over the Iraqi military. It is training the Iraqi military and fighting alongside the Iraqi military with ISIS. But at this point, right now, the prime minister of Iraq is suggesting that the U.S. leave. Are you concerned that the prime minister has said the U.S. should leave Iraq in response to the U.S. decision to kill Qasem Soleimani?
Well, the prime minister is a lame duck, until there's a constitutional crisis in Iraq right now, until we have a new government in place, the statements that he's making don't really matter. And the key question is not whether we stay in Iraq or not. We're under attack as we speak from the IRGC, firing missiles from Iran at an American base. So the question isn't anymore what the prime minister of Iraq is saying, what the half of the parliament is saying. The question is, what are we going to do about this direct attack on American forces from the Iranians? And there's no choice here whatsoever. If we're to achieve any of our goals in the Middle East, then we have to demonstrate to the world and to the Iranians that they cannot treat us like this.
Mara Karlin, is that how you see it? Is the response from the Iraqi prime minister less important right now? And does the U.S. simply need to respond, again, back where we were, kind of raising up on that escalatory ladder?
Nick, the conversation is completely changed because of this attack. The U.S. and Iraq are divided. The U.S. is divided from its European allies. Iran has been facing the largest protests in 40 years. That is off the headlines. The fight against the Islamic State is now on hold at best. It's a little bit hard to figure out how, as Mike is saying, any sort of deterrence would be restored.
Mike, what about that? The coalition in Iraq did acknowledge that the fight against ISIS was on hold. There have been other side effects of Qasem Soleimani's death. Are you worried about all of that affecting things as the U.S. decides how to respond tonight?
The greatest strategic threat that the United States has faced in the Middle East for the last decade is the rise of Iran across the region, the proliferation of these militias across the Arab world, the distribution to those militias of precision-guided weaponry, and the effort of Iran to use those new positions to undermine the American security system in the region. If we're going to stay in this region and if we are going to lead this region, then we have to demonstrate that we cannot be pushed around by Iran in this way. If we're ever going to achieve an Iran without nuclear weapons, which 4 presidents have said is absolutely unacceptable, then we have to win this round, and we have to win it decisively. There's no other choice.
Mara Karlin, in the 45 seconds or so that we have left, Mike Doran brings up that Iran has been spreading missiles throughout the region. This, however, is a response, apparently, from Iran itself, from the Revolutionary Guard. Just explain that significance and how important and how fraught this moment is.
Absolutely. I mean, we are in probably the most tense moment that the U.S. has been in the Middle East for decades, to put it lightly. I mean, easily since the Iraq invasion. What's particularly ironic, however, is that the Trump administration has continued to be, like previous administrations before it, embroiled in Middle East purgatory. Its strategy of focusing on China, of focusing on the real geopolitical challenges, on great power competition, are invariably going to melt away as the Middle East continues to surge to the top of the priority list.
Michael Doran, just in the last few seconds that I have, can you just respond to that, please?
The United States is much more powerful than Iran. Iran is like a puffer fish. It looks powerful because of these militias with these precision-guided weapons and because of its boldness. It's suffering an unprecedented crisis of legitimacy at home. Its position in Iraq has been challenged by protesters on the ground who want Iran out of Iraq. It is behaving in this aggressive fashion in order to look much stronger than it is. We can best this adversary with relative ease.
Michael Doran from the Hudson Institute, Mara Karlin from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thanks very much to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We know that the White House was considering a presidential address to the nation tonight, a televised address. They decided against it. Nick, you are still here with me. We don't know what the administration thinks its options are now, do we?
Yeah, U.S. officials will be weighing a response to this, a military response, a kinetic response. You heard Mike Doran argue that point, which is, look, this was a big escalation. This was a launch from Iran, by Iran taking credit. On the other hand, Judy, there will be some arguing, perhaps in the administration, that this is nowhere near the level, nowhere near equal, if you will, to what the U.S. did disturbing or killing Qasem Soleimani. But regardless, the most tense moment in the Middle East, Judy, in more than 15 years. And tonight's attack capped a tense day here and in Iran, in which President Trump was pressed to explain why he ordered Soleimani's killing, and more than 50 people were killed during Soleimani's funeral procession. So let's show you our story from earlier today, recapping all those events. A day in Iran meant for mourning a military commander will now lead to the mourning of many more. The stampede came during the funeral procession of Major General Qasem Soleimani through his hometown. All that remained was a pile of shoes. Standing before hundreds of thousands, the commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard promised vengeance.
I say to our enemies, we will take revenge. But if they take another step in response, we will set fire to the places they love, and they know where these places are.
That language was echoed by Iran's top diplomat, Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, who also shut the door to any future prisoner swaps.
The United States is bound to receive a definitive and certain response for its outrageous act at a time and in a place where it would feel the utmost pain.
The New York Times reported that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, wants retaliation to be a, quote, direct and proportional attack on American interests and openly carried out by Iranian forces. That's a contrast to many previous attacks conducted by Iran's network of proxy groups. Iran's parliament today voted to designate the Pentagon and U.S. Army terrorist organizations. At the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper said the ball was in Iran's court.
The United States is not seeking a war with Iran, but we are prepared to finish one. We are seeking a diplomatic solution, but first, this will require Iran to de-escalate.
Yesterday, the U.S. military said it mistakenly sent a draft letter to the Iraqi government suggesting the U.S. was withdrawing troops from Iraq. Today, Iraq's caretaker prime minister said he was treating it as policy, but Esper said there'd been no change.
We are not leaving Iraq, and a draft unsigned letter does not constitute a policy change.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo today said the U.S.'s policy of maximum pressure would continue, and he reiterated, without evidence, the intelligence that led the U.S. to target Soleimani suggested an imminent attack in the days after the siege on the U.S. embassy.
If you're looking for imminence, you needn't look no further than the days that led up to the strike that was taken against Soleimani.
President Trump also defended the intelligence, but walked back an earlier threat to attack Iranian cultural sites.
And we are, according to various laws, supposed to be very careful with their cultural heritage. And you know what? If that's what the law is, I like to obey the law.
On Capitol Hill, lawmakers continued their clash over President Trump's Iran policy. Top Senate Democrat Chuck Schumer.
The president has promised that he would not drag the American people into another endless war in the Middle East. The president's actions, however, have seemingly increased the risk that we could be dragged into exactly such a war.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
When he enforces his red lines, when he takes real action to counter lethal threats against Americans.
Administration officials are briefing Congress today and tomorrow, trying to create bipartisan support as they await Iran's response. And Judy, of course, tonight we now know what Iran's first response has been.
These attacks on Americans at the bases, but no casualties is the word that we hear.
As far as we know right now.
Nick Schifrin, thank you for all this reporting tonight.
Thank you.